Welcome to week 5 of English 320, where we focus on high modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. This week, pay close attention to how writers reshape form to capture fractured experience, new identities, and rapidly changing social realities. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify key characteristics of modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, and explain how historical and cultural context shaped themes and formal techniques. Pause here and read through this week's learning outcomes. As we move into the 1920s, please treat this decade as a study in contradiction and creation. On the one hand, you have cultural rebirth and new artistic energy, especially during the Harlem Renaissance, shaped by the Great Migration and the development of new communities, institutions, and audiences. On the other hand, you have a modern world that feels disorienting, with war's aftermath, rapid urban change, new technologies, and mass culture reshaping how people understand themselves and each other. Here's the critical move I want you to practice. Think like a historian, but read like a literary critic. Ask what pressures the texts are responding to and how those pressures show up on the page. Where do you see migration, modern cities, technology, or mass culture changing the way a speaker thinks, notices, remembers, or fears? Pay attention to form as evidence, because writers like Eliot, Joyce, and Woolf are not just telling stories, they are experimenting with structure to represent modern consciousness. In connection to last week's lecture, early modernism from the 1890s to 1914 was a period of experimental, transitional, and diverse moments like symbolism and early avant garde, focusing on questioning realism. Whereas high modernism, the focus of this week's lecture, from the 1920s to the 1930s, was the peak post war phase, characterized by intense fragmentation, disillusionment, and complex self conscious techniques such as stream of consciousness, mythic method. As you read, notice interruptions such as memory flashes, list quotations or allusions, and ask what they reveal about the mind and what the mind cannot leave alone. Track repetition across sounds, images, or phrases because repetition often marks anxiety, fixation, longing, or avoidance. Also, notice when the text refuses closure because that resistance can be the point, especially when modern life feels unresolved. Here is the discussion question I want you to carry into your reading. When a modernist text feels hard to follow, what is that difficulty doing to you as the reader? And why might the writer want that effect? As you answer, use at least one specific moment from the text to prove your claim with evidence. Now we add another layer, memory. Notice that we are studying memory in two ways. We are not only asking how modernist texts represent memory within the story or poem, but also how modernism itself is remembered, taught, celebrated, and reinterpreted over time. In other words, movements have a history, but also a memory, shaped by institutions, textbooks, anniversaries, and repeated stories about what counts as essential. I want you to treat the debate prompt as a critical thinking exercise, not as a fact to memorize. Should 1922 be treated as modernism's defining moment? What do we gain when we anchor a movement to a single landmark year? And what do we lose? A single date can make a timeline easier to teach, but it can also flatten a longer process and hide writers, genres, and communities that do not fit the headline. Now let's shift our attention to the Harlem Renaissance as a period of cultural work, not just a list of authors. You'll see a cultural rebirth that spans literature, music like jazz and blues, visual art, and performance. As you read, keep asking what kind of identity is being claimed, defended, or contested, and who the implied audience seems to be. A major thread in this era is representation, including debates about stereotype, self definition, respectability, and what it means to speak for a community or to refuse that responsibility. Here's your critical thinking check for the week. If you think a text is celebrating something or critiquing something, prove it. Identify the exact word choices, images, tone shifts, and speaker posture or structural moves that support your claim. The Great Migration was a massive movement of African Americans from the rural South to urban centers in the North and Midwest, shaped by both push factors and pull factors. People were leaving Jim Crow conditions and racial violence, and they were also moving towards jobs, wages, and the possibility of building a different life in cities. That movement reshaped American cities, neighborhood life, politics, and the audiences that market art. When large numbers of people relocate, culture relocates too. Harlem became one of the most visible hubs because it concentrated talent, institutions, and audiences into one place. That concentration matters. It creates networks of writers, musicians, editors, patrons, venues, and community organizations that can simply amplify new work. So think of Harlem less as a single neighborhood and more as an engine that circulates art. Here's the critical thinking move I want you to practice. When you hear a phrase like cultural rebirth or artistic explosion, please do not treat it as automatic praise. Ask what is being reborn, who is included, who is left out, and what tensions are inside the movement. Then prove your answer with evidence from the text. When we talk about high modernism, it's often described as a movement that leans into difficulty on purpose. Writers are experimenting with fragmentation, with inner thoughts, with uncertainty, and that kind of writing gets labeled as genius. But here's the thing, we also have to ask who decided that? Because it's not just about the text themselves, it's also about institutions, publishers, critics, universities that have the power to say this is important, this is canonical, and this is what counts as great literature. Now, the Harlem Renaissance is also incredibly innovative, but it's coming from a very different place. Segregation and discrimination aren't just background contexts, they shape everything. They affect who the audience is, who gets published, and what's at stake when you tell a story. So, Harlem Renaissance writers were also experimenting, but in different ways, with voice, with dialect, with performance, with folklore, with urban life. But at the same time, they're having real debates like, who are we writing for? who gets to represent Black life, what counts as authentic and what's strategic. And those debates, that tension, that's not separate from the movement. That is the movement. Now I want you to take a position on the debate question, and I want you to defend it with evidence. Is the Harlem Renaissance best taught as part of modernism alongside it, or as its own movement? If you argue part of modernism, you need to show concrete overlap in techniques or shared modern pressures, and then explain what the label clarifies. If you argue alongside, you need to explain what comparison reveals without collapsing the differences. If you argue its own movement, you need to explain what gets distorted when we fold it into a modernism story built around institutions and definitions that were not neutral. Whatever stance you choose, you must anchor it in specifics. Let's shift gears to critical analysis. A critical lens is just a way of looking at a text. Well, think of it like putting on different pairs of glasses. Depending on the lens you use, you notice different things. For example, if I put on my money glasses, I'm looking at wealth, class, power. If I put on gender glasses, I'm looking at how men and women are treated. If I put on nature glasses, I'm looking at how people interact with the environment. There is no one correct interpretation, just stronger or weaker ones based on evidence. This is a list of some of the most common lenses. For this unit, we will be analyzing literature through two lenses, Marxism and ecofeminism. Pause here and take a screenshot of this graphic for your notes. Analyzing literature through a Marxist lens means following the money, the status, and the rules of belonging. This approach asks a simple set of questions. Who has power in the world of the text? Who does not? And how is that power tied to wealth, work, social class, and the ability to control access to opportunities? When you read Fitzgerald through this lens, pay attention to the difference between having money and having legitimacy. Notice how class is performed through taste, language, manners, where people live, what they wear, and who they are allowed to be near. Also notice how the plot often turns on gatekeeping, on who gets invited in and who gets shut out, and on how easily someone can be reduced to what they can buy or what they represent socially. This week, we are also applying an ecofeminist lens to Hurston Sweat. The big idea is interconnection. This lens asks how systems of power can dominate both women and the non human world, and how language makes that domination seem normal. In other words, we are going to watch how the text uses nature and animal imagery, and we are going to ask what those images are doing socially and morally. Two key terms to keep in mind are naturalization and animalization. Naturalization is when nature imagery is used to make a social structure seem natural or inevitable, as if it is just the way the world works. Animalization is when animal imagery is used to reduce someone's humanity or to frame them as uncontrollable, expendable, or inferior. As you read, Do not just spot the image. Ask who controls the metaphor, who gets described through it, and what effect that description has on how we judge the characters. As you gather evidence, look closely at descriptions of work and labor, because labor often exposes who benefits and who bears the cost. Track the pony and its treatment because it can function as a parallel to control, cruelty, and endurance. Pay attention to the bullwhip and the snake imagery and what those objects signal about fear, power, and intimidation. And listen to the community talk. Notice how the community frames Delia, what they assume about her, and what they choose to watch without intervening. When you make an argument about a text, I want you to move past what happened and focus on how the text produces meaning. A strong interpretation starts with a genuinely debatable claim, not a plot summary, but a statement about how the writing works and what that work accomplishes. Then you earn that claim with evidence. Evidence means specific details you can point to, like diction, imagery, structure, narration, or patterns that repeat across scenes. If I cannot locate what you are describing in the text, the claim is not finished yet. Next comes the warrant, and this is where a lot of strong ideas become strong arguments. Tell me why the evidence supports your claim. Connect the dots. Explain how form, context, and the lens you are using make your interpretation plausible. After that, test your reading by naming a counter reading. What is a reasonable alternative interpretation someone else could make from the same passage? Then explain using evidence why your reading fits the details better. This is not about winning, it's about showing that you understand the text well enough to anticipate disagreement and respond with proof, not attitude. Finally, run a quality check on yourself. Avoid overgeneralizing from one movement, avoid selective quoting that ignores contradictions, and avoid assuming there is only one author's intent that settles everything. If you want a quick test, try this. If someone disagreed with your interpretation, what evidence would they point to, and how would you respond using the text? As we wrap up, I want you to hear this clearly. These lenses belong to you. The value of this toolkit is not memorizing definitions. The value is learning how to apply a lens on purpose and then noticing how your interpretation changes when you switch lenses or combine them. There is rarely one single correct reading. The real work begins when you start asking better questions than you asked before. This concludes this week's lecture. As always, if you have questions, reach out to me via email during office hours, or you can drop your questions in the discussion board. I'm always happy to meet with you. Have a good day. See you next time.